Hi everyone, welcome to Bonnie Carolee Makes Cards. I have a cute card for you today featuring Simon Says Stamps Narwhal Friends from the Hello Beautiful release. The images in this stamp set are absolutely adorable, and it comes with many wonderful sentiments to support them. So let's get started with this background of watercolor bubbles to highlight these sweet narwhals. I began with an oversized sheet of Canson XL watercolor paper. Both the front and the back of the panel were brushed liberally with water. This tip allows the panel to lay flat. There will be no warping or slipping. The background for this card begins with a color wash. I'm working with Ken Oliver's Liquid Metals, a combination of the metallic turquoise and the metallic emerald. To soften the color, I did add some additional water. After applying the blue randomly across the panel, I followed up with spritzes of water to help soften that color further and to move it around. The watered down metallic emerald is dropped into the white space. Again, I follow up with spritzes of water to help that green and blue blend together where they meet. While the panel was still wet, the color looks much bolder than it actually will be when it's dry. After a long drying time, the panel was trimmed down using Pinkfresh Studio's slim stitched rectangles. And now for the watercolor bubbles. I began by tracing 3 large circles that would highlight each of the narwhals. The pencil line was kept light so that it would not be seen after the bubbles were painted. The circles for the smaller bubbles were free-handed. Some of the circles overlapped one another, and I erased those lines before I start painting. I will use just one color, peacock blue, from my Mission Gold watercolor paints. It's been a while since I've watercolored bubbles, and so I thought it best to start off with the small ones before I tackle the 3 big ones. I begin by applying clean water to the bubble. The top of the bubble is the shadow area. The peacock blue is very saturated as it is applied to the top. By saturated, I mean that I'm using just enough water to pick up that color. I reapply the color until I get the intensity that I want. After the brush is cleaned off, I use clean water to help pull that color down into a gradient. The shadow area is not as deep as I want it, so I go ahead and add more peacock blue to the top and then use clean water to pull it down as before. The highlight for the bubble will be at the bottom, and I'm going to use white Winsor Newton gouache paint, watered down slightly. The same process is followed for the highlight as it was for the shadow area. The gouache is applied to the bottom of the bubble. The brush is cleaned off. I pick up just a little bit of water and then do a gradient, pulling that paint up towards the shadow area. A very saturated peacock blue line is placed around the bottom of the bubble to create another shadow area. A thin line of gouache is applied at the base of the bubble to intensify the highlight. Reflective light is created at the top of the bubble in the shadow area using the gouache to make just a small line and a couple of dots. One bubble down and so many more to go. Painting these bubbles did take me a fair amount of time. But like anything else, when you do it over and over and over again, it actually does get quicker as you move along. So I'll just let you watch as I complete this second bubble. I'm following the exact same steps as I did for the previous one. The process will be reviewed when I tackle one of the large bubbles. So now to finish up this background with one of the large bubbles. The peacock blue paint is quite saturated and applied to the top of the bubble. With a clean brush and clean water, the blue is pulled down into a gradient. More blue paint is added to intensify the shadow area. White gouache is applied to the base of the bubble to create the highlight. Clean brush and clean water is used to pull that highlight up into a gradient up into the shadow area. A saturated blue line is painted at the base of the bubble to create another shadow area. More gouache is applied to the base of the bubble to intensify the highlight area. The bubble is finished up with the reflective light marks at the top of the bubble. With all the bubbles completed, I go back with a zero paintbrush and I cover over any pencil lines that may be showing. I go about one shade deeper than the blue that is in the area that I'm outlining. The background is finished up with spatter. The panel is placed inside a spatter box, and watered down gouache is spattered using the same brush that I used to do the outlining. I love spatter. My bubbles are far from perfect, and the spatter really helps to hide some of those imperfections. The 3 narwhals included with Narwhal Friends was stamped on Canson XL watercolor paper. I wanted to emboss them in black to make the watercoloring easier. I'm not a fan of black embossing powder. If you have any stray bits, it is hard to disguise them. Instead, the images were stamped with black onyx VersaFine ink. I stamped a couple of times because of the texture on the watercolor paper. This ink does not dry immediately, so it is perfect for applying clear embossing powder. You have the look of a black emboss line with none of the mess. When the color wash background was die cut with the slimline stitched rectangle, I had some leftover color wash background that I used for the sentiments. The sentiments were also stamped with black VersaFine ink and clear embossed. All 3 sentiments were die cut using Simon Says Stamps sentiment labels. This is definitely one of the die sets that I reach for the most often. The sentiment strip is aligned to the grid on Tim Holtz guillotine cutter. The ends were trimmed off. When working with these small sentiment strips, I really appreciate the press plate feature. It just makes sure that sentiment stays straight. Like the bubbles, the narwhals were painted with Mission Gold watercolor paints. I just worked with the blue and a green mixture that I had left over on my palette. Each section of the narwhal was painted separately by wetting it first and then dropping in some color. The painting is straightforward, with the shadow areas at the base of the narwhal and highlights at the top. The embossed lines make the painting go very quickly, unlike the bubbles. Some of the deeper tone is added to the base of the tusk and along the bottom of the spiraling lines to add dimension. A zero brush is used to apply some gouache to give some texture to the backs of the whales. The images are fussy cut along the embossed line. This is straightforward and easy cutting because the shapes are simple. The 3 sentiment strips are mounted on white sheet foam and trimmed down. The card base is also mounted on white sheet foam and then onto a card base that measures 3 5/8 inches by 8 7/8 inches. After the narwhals were adhered to the foam, they were fussy cut at an angle so that it followed the basic outline but would not be visible. Each narwhal and a sentiment strip was attached to its own bubble. I had a mixture of green and blue bubble crystals that were perfect for this background. The crystals were adhered with Nouveau Precision Glue. When it is depressed on the paper, it leaves a small dot of glue, perfect for adhering anything small. Black Nouveau drops were added to the narwhal's eyes. This really makes them pop. If you are unhappy with the dot size on your image, the black Nouveau drops in particular can be quite unforgiving and could ruin it. I always practice on paper first until I can consistently get the size that I'm aiming for. Better to sacrifice a little bit of your Nouveau drops to preserve your hard work. And that wraps up today's card featuring Simon Says Stamps, Narwhal Friends from their Hello Beautiful release. Here are a couple of other cards that I made with Narwhal Friends. Details can be found on my blog at www.bonniecarolee.com. As always, I appreciate your visit.